Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's see. My chat is not connecting, so give me a second here to make that work. All right. I think that's good there. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. We have some questions already on deck here, so we'll just get started right away. All right. First question I had was about, and I've had this question several times, so it's a good question to answer. Someone wanted to know what version of the Bible is best for us to read. As you know, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written mostly in Greek. The Old Testament, though, was translated to Greek before the time of Christ, so he would have been familiar with the version in Greek as a man, of course, as God, he's familiar with everything. But anything other than the original is a translation. A translation always is going to be weaker than the original because there are nuances in each language that, I could say something even in English and maybe it means something in English different than somebody who maybe speaks English from a different language, who speaks a different language. So English has a lot of nuances, and so does Hebrew, so does Greek. So there could be plays on words that we don't necessarily get. So of course, if you really, really want to know the Bible, you have to study those other languages. But for the most part, that's not going to be practical for all of us. So what do we do? What do we read in English? Well, so we have the Orthodox Study Bible, but we have to know the Orthodox Study Bible is not an Orthodox translation. The Orthodox Study Bible is just the New King James Version with some very simple and basic commentary. And the commentary, for the most part, is not from the saints. I think some of the Old Testament commentary is from the saints, but most of it just from Orthodox priests who may or may not have a doctorate in a certain subject, making comments. I know in seminary we were never allowed to use that as a source to quote the comments from the Orthodox Study Bible. But again, the Orthodox Study Bible is just the New King James Version of the Bible. And then it has the books of the Septuagint that were taken out of the King James Version. So you could use that. It's not going to be perfect, but again, nothing's going to be perfect. You could also use the Revised Standard Version, the RSV. A lot of people use that. If you want, there is a version that I recommend, but it's only available in the New Testament and the Book of Psalms. There is a convent in Buena Vista, Colorado, called Holy Apostles Convent, and it's the only Orthodox translation. Now, I will warn you, it doesn't read very smooth in English, and that's because they tried to capture the Greek as best as possible. But along with that, especially if you buy the different volumes they have New Testament Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 are the four Gospels. Volume 2 is Acts of the Apostles through Revelation. It also comes with commentary from the Church Fathers, and I find that very helpful. And they have the Book of Psalms also with commentary. So you can buy the small version without the commentary or the bigger versions with the commentary. I think those are the best. Again, we don't have the whole Old Testament. All we have from the Old Testament is the Book of Psalms, but they do have the New Testament in two different volumes, and that's the entire New Testament. So if you really want to see what it says in the Bible as closely as I've ever seen it translated in English, I would recommend that. Again, it's Holy Apostles Convent in Buena Vista, Colorado. You can look it up, give them a call, order the books. If you want me to order the books for you, I can do that through the bookstore. So that's what my opinion on reading the Bible in English. This is also why we have our church fathers who give us commentary. A lot of non-Orthodox Christians say, well, why don't you just read the Bible yourself and interpret it for yourself? Part of it is because you can't understand it yourself. When we read the commentaries of St. John Chrysostom, whose first language was Greek, or St. Basil the Great, whose first language was Greek, or a number of these other saints who really understood the scriptural languages, that's where we're going to get the best commentaries, the best understanding. St. Ephraim the Syrian, who spoke the same language as, he probably spoke Hebrew, and he spoke Assyrian and those Semitic languages, as well as Greek. Those are the commentaries that you want to read because they understood the language, not to mention they live very holy lives and have the Holy Spirit living in them, and are able to translate or explain the Bible way better than you and I would be able to from reading it. So that's a little bit on that. My next question here, and I do have a number of questions already, but if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. So let's see. Regarding the procession of the gifts during the Divine Liturgy, meaning the Great Entrance, is it a blessing to touch the vestment of the priest as he walks by? I've been doing this with great reverence since I was a catechumen. So yes, there is a pious tradition that when the priest is holding the gifts, the chalice and the discos with the wine and the bread on there before they're consecrated, there is a tradition that as the priest is walking by, you can reach out and touch his vestments. Now, just kind of a caution, you want to be gentle with the priest as he's doing that because he's already trying to balance these things. The discos has a star on it, which kind of wobbles a little bit and all that. So you want to make sure not to pull or yank the priest. So be gentle. But yes, this actually comes from the tradition of the woman with the issue of blood, who, as Christ was walking by, she reached out and touched the hem of his garment and was healed. And actually, this is going to be part of my second sermon on Sunday. Her name is Saint Veronica, and we celebrate her on Sunday. So Saint Veronica is the woman who touched the hem of Christ's garment and was healed. So as a pious tradition, it's not necessary, but it's a pious tradition, especially if you have some kind of an illness that you want to be cured from. You can reach out and touch the priest's garment, especially the cape. It's called the phalonion. We have a question about the priest's vestments, so I'll talk about those in a little bit. Let's see. You are welcome to touch the priest's vestments as he's walking by. Another tradition, again, for somebody who's feeling sick or maybe kind of beaten up by life or anything like that. Sometimes you may see somebody come, and while I'm reading the gospel, they'll come right up underneath me and kneel underneath the gospel for healing. It's a pious tradition. If you like to ever do something like that, there's nothing against it. Those things are nice traditions. Okay, John Rahal, your question did not come through in the chat, but I think I got an email from you. So I'll answer your question here. Actually, it did not come through on email. There it is on Facebook. Okay, let me read this. So this is a long question. Please bear with me. Please provide us your thoughts on this statement by Saint Hilarion, who lived in Russia before and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. He was born 3 years after the death of Karl Marx and was a contemporary of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. He wrote an extensive piece on socialism, but this brief statement summarizes the spirit of it. Socialism is the mystery of iniquity, which the Holy Apostle Paul prophesied. Every member of the church must be aware of this, and it is essential that the church explain this for all the world to hear. If passing into heresy entails separation from the church, passing into socialism is an error more grievous than any heresy, and is even more deserving of punishment. How can one speak of the Christianization of socialism? These are empty words. Christian socialism is a contradiction in terms. What is Christian cannot be socialist. If we do not loudly and openly declare that socialism is the enemy of Christianity, nothing will result except harm and scandal. All compromises are inappropriate here. One must look one's enemy in the eye. To underestimate danger is always delirious. So that was a quote from Saint Hilarion Troitsky. He's a new martyr under the Soviets. So, John, thank you for that question. Yeah, I've been asked that before. And actually, with all the kind of social justice things going on in the world now, and of course, everybody is an expert on everything on Facebook. I've seen some memes that say Jesus was a socialist, right? Jesus told us to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. He criticized the Jew, the Levite, and the priest for not helping the Samaritan but walking on the other side, whereas the Samaritan came and helped him. So from all that, somebody who doesn't know Jesus very well might say, oh, well, it looks like Jesus is a socialist. Jesus is not a socialist. Socialism goes against the teachings of the gospel. Again, socialism goes against the teachings of the gospel. And again, this is not just my opinion. It is my opinion because it's the opinion of the saints of the church. You just heard a saint who lived in Russia during socialism and communism tell you that socialism is a sin and it's a delusion and it's evil. How can we reconcile the fact that Jesus was not a socialist if he told us to do all those things that a socialist would say, well, yeah, that's what we're teaching. Here's a difference, big difference, okay? Jesus told you to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and feed, clothe, visit. He said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, right? He told that to you. He told it to me. He told it to every Christian out there. So he wants me and you to go out there and do the works ourselves. He doesn't want us to take a collection and wash our hands of it and have the government take care of people who need help. He wants me and you to do it because we have to have that human connection. He wants us to have that human connection with people. And he doesn't want the government to mandate me to do it. Because if the government says I'm taking 30 or 40% taxes and then don't worry about the homeless, we'll take care of them. What credit is that to me as a Christian if the government is doing it on my behalf? No, I have to make the decision, which means I also have the decision not to do it, right? Because I have free will. But if I don't do it, then I'm going to be punished like Christ, as he speaks of in the later chapters of Matthew. He will separate us to his left as he separates the goats. So that is why socialism is incompatible with Christianity. God requires each one of us to have whatever he decided that we should have, whether we are rich or poor. God let us be born into that situation, or maybe earn that situation, right? But even when we earn it, we have to realize that it's not really ours. It's all God's. And he is telling us, commanding us to go and take care of the poor in the world. He does not want us to rely on the government to do it. He wants us to do it. And I say this to right-wingers and left-wingers. He wants you to do it. So if you're on the right wing and say, yeah, it's just up to me, well, you're going to be judged harshly if you don't do it. And on the left wing, it's no credit if the government is forcing you to do it and is taking your money and doing it. So free health care and, taking care of the homeless and all that kind of stuff. It'd be nice if we could do that. As a church, I would love for our church to do more of that kind of stuff, where our own parishioners can come and be involved in the ministry of the church and the Christian ministry. I would love to one day open a clinic for people who don't have money and health insurance to come get some kind of medical care. That would be a beautiful thing. But that's a lot of work, and we need some commitment. But if you're not a doctor and you don't have healing power, that's a way that you can help support a ministry like this and heal people. So there are a lot of ways to do it. Socialism is not one of those ways. Socialism, by the way, is atheist, and especially communist is. Orthodoxy has lived through socialism and communism. It does not work. It is very much against the church. Please do not support socialism or communism. It's evil. And again, not just my opinion. You heard it from the mouth of a saint just a minute ago. Well, my mouth, but his words. Okay. We got some more questions here, but again, feel free to write your questions. Regarding memorial prayers and services and praying for the health of family and friends, do the people we ask you to pray for in the service need to be Orthodox Christians or members of the church? I have friends who have family who are buried without a service and feel someone should pray for them. It is appropriate to add to your pray list to include them like the Baptists and other denominations do. So thank you for that question. We are always welcome to pray for anybody, and we should pray for everybody. So you specifically who asked the question, and all of us are welcome to pray for anybody and everybody, whether they are Orthodox or not. There are different priests who have different practices up to a certain extent. For example, the list of people that you maybe want me to pray for at the Great Entrance. Some priests believe that those should only be Orthodox Christians. I make some exceptions. If they're related to our parish somehow, I don't want the list to get like hugely inappropriately long for that part of the service. It might be more appropriate to do it at a service like Paraklesis, where that's where we're reading a huge list of names. But by the way, I require, unless you're sick and unable to be at church, I require that if you give me a list of names to read, that you be there yourself. You can't just like pass the buck on to the priest. It doesn't mean much if you do it like that. However, the list that I pray for people at Holy Communion, that's what we call proskomidi. So that's the service where I'm preparing Holy Communion. I pray for people by name. And I have a huge list already. That list can only be Orthodox people, because when they get put on the diskos, which has the body of Christ, the Theotokos, the saints, and then the living and the departed, it's an icon, a picture of the entire church. And if they're not Orthodox Christians, they're not part of the church. And so it's good to let me know if somebody is not Orthodox, if you ever ask me to pray for them, so that I don't include them on that list. It's not proper. I even have family members who I don't include on that list. And it's painful. I would love to pray for them, but I'm not able to because they're not part of the church. So that's my answer to that. Okay. We have another question here. Okay. What are the passions, and are they the same as or more like precursors to the 7 deadly sins? So they are pretty much the same thing. In the Roman Catholic Church and some of the Western churches, they talk about the 7 deadly sins, which are pretty much the same as our passions. They're things like gluttony and lust and anger and avarice and things like that. So they're kind of the same thing. Passions are more, it's a better word to describe what they are. Maybe in today's like modern psychology word, we'd call them addictions, like sins that are addictions. But the idea of calling them deadly sins, I also kind of like that, because it shows the severity of them. And it's not that they're like it's just one sin. So it's not just like I killed somebody, so I'm going to die now, right? It's kind of a misunderstanding. But the idea that if you don't get healed from that particular passion, it could kill your soul and you may end up going to hell. So when you have one of these passions, which we all have passions, these are sins that could keep us from heaven. And so that's why the West calls them deadly sins. So they are pretty much the same as what they are in the West. We may deal with them a little bit differently. And we believe the mother of all sin, the chief passion, is pride. So that's a little bit on the passions there. The next question says, can you give me a definition or description of Orthodox evangelism? So Orthodox evangelism can take on different forms. Here in America, we're in a different kind of situation. You know, in Orthodox countries like Russia and Romania and Serbia and Georgia, the entire country kind of became Orthodox at once for the most part. And that's because you had rulers like kings who would just declare they loved Orthodoxy, and they would declare that that was the national religion of the people from that point forward. Excuse me. So we come to a place like America, and what do we do? How do we evangelize? Before I get to America, because it's a little complicated, let me jump to Africa real quick. We have a beautiful presence. I don't know if you know this. We have a beautiful presence of Orthodoxy in some African countries. A couple of those countries are Kenya and Uganda. So, and they're under the Patriarch of Alexandria, who's in Egypt, right? So he's the Patriarch of all Africa. Fun fact, his title is Pope and Patriarch of Alexandria, and he's also known as Commander of the Universe. That's a whole question and discussion in itself, how he got that title, but it's kind of a neat title. He's Commander of the Universe. So Orthodox evangelism, I'll tell you, in Kenya and Uganda, the Orthodox went and served the people. They gave them clean drinking water. This is what organizations like OCMC, the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, does. They gave them clean drinking water. They helped educate their children. They gave them food. They just helped them with life. And then they had classes on Orthodoxy, and the people could go to these classes, learn about Orthodoxy, and eventually convert, but it was not a prerequisite for getting the other things. In other words, we gave them the food and the water and the education out of love, and they later, because they saw that light of Christ coming from the Orthodox Church, whereas other churches were like, well, we will give you these things if you convert, right? So the Orthodox Church, they wanted to become Orthodox, and so they were made Orthodox. And you can look up on YouTube. Actually, a friend of mine who I went to school with is now the Bishop of Kenya. We were in school together. I was at Hellenic College in Boston while he was at in the master's program at Holy Cross. And so I got to know him. I'd like to bring him to our church sometime. Very interesting man. And he speaks Greek better than I do. But he's a native of Kenya. I met a number of seminarians and priests from that region of the world. There's a beautiful video in Uganda of the people singing and actually even dancing in the church to Christ is risen. It's very neat. Any of the videos, I'm friends with this bishop on Facebook, and I see a lot of the videos he posts. These people have so little. They're dirt poor, yet they always have a song in their heart, and they're always dancing and joyful, and it just kind of fit Orthodoxy. But how do we do evangelism in America? Certainly, each and every one of you are called to be evangelists of the faith, and I've spoken about that several times in my homilies, that it's a command from Christ at our baptisms to go therefore and preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So it's your job to do that. It's actually less my job, because my job is to be that to you as your priest. It's your job to go out and do that in your community. So and how do we do that? We do that by living Christian lives. People should be asking you, they should be intrigued by your life and say, you know what? This person's always at peace. This person just seems close to God. This person has light radiating from them. How can I be like them, right? So if you're living your Christianity, Saint Seraphim of Sarov says, 1,000 around you will be saved. And that's all you have to do is really live your faith, and people will want to find what you have and come to the faith. So come to live that faith, and feel free to, pray before you eat. Make the sign of the cross. Say a prayer, even in public. People might ask you, what are you doing? And we're not doing it to be seen. That would defeat the purpose and actually be counterintuitive. But let's not be ashamed of being Christians in public, wearing our crosses in public. People ask me sometimes why I wear my casket in public, almost embarrassed for me, right? I do it because all the time people ask me what denomination I'm in, where I'm a priest of. It starts up a conversation just by the way I'm dressed, just by the way I look. So I welcome that, and I'm certainly not ashamed of it. I hope nobody's embarrassed that their priest dresses as a priest in public. That would be kind of like when Christ says, if you're embarrassed by me or do not acknowledge me in public, then I will deny you before my Father. So that's kind of a serious thing. But there are other churches, getting back to the question here about evangelism. So our number one way of being evangelists is just to live the faith. So long in this country, our churches have only been concerned with themselves. A lot of our ancestors came to this country very poor. They built these churches. They worked very hard, and it became kind of like their own clubs. And that's not a healthy way for a church to be. I understand that we needed a few years to build and to kind of establish ourselves. But churches like our church has been around for over 100 years. We should really have been building Orthodox churches all across Charleston at this point. But we haven't focused enough on evangelism. So evangelism these days can take on a number of forms. They can be, you can host Bible studies at your house where you just, have questions about the faith that you kind of bring up, and maybe, you read something from an Orthodox saint or something like that. You can invite me over to your home if you have a bunch of your non-Orthodox friends over who like to discuss these kind of things, and we can have a conversation. You can invite them to church. But we could also do more as a church to get the word out there. And certainly we have a website. One of the purposes of having a website is to do evangelistic work. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else here in this one. Okay. So Beverly asked a question right here on the screen. Let me get that before I go back to my other questions. And the question is, I have a question. Is there a certain protocol for having the casket lid open or closed before the funeral starts? So I'll tell you, Metropolitan Philip of blessed memory preferred that the casket be closed inside the church. The reason for that, in some of our parishes, you probably have not experienced this very much here in Charleston, but in the Middle Eastern culture, people make big scenes at funerals, especially if the person is younger. They make like really big scenes. And I've experienced this. I was in a primarily Palestinian and Jordanian parish where they felt like if you didn't make a big scene at a funeral, that it was like the person that you didn't love the person. So I've had people jump into the casket with people. I've had them smush their grandchildren's faces in their grandfather's dead body, things like that, which are traumatic. So Metropolitan Philip had a rule that the casket should always be closed. But since then, Metropolitan Joseph, I'm not sure. I believe he prefers the casket to be open, which is more the Orthodox tradition. We don't hide death as Orthodox Christians. We're not fearful of it. A lot of what funeral homes do is try and make death more beautiful, right? I once attended a funeral in one of the churches I worked for before I was a priest. And the person, after they opened the casket, they saw their mother and they got very upset. And they called the funeral director over and they were just really unhappy. And they said, she doesn't even look alive. And I was thinking to myself, she's not. And you laugh, but isn't that what we want? I mean, we look at the person and we say, oh, they look better than they did when they were alive. And that's looking better than they did when they were alive. That's kind of a sign from God. But of course, we don't see that as much because the funeral director is now putting makeup and embalming fluids and keep the eyes closed and all this kind of. They do all these things to the body. Which, by the way, myself, I don't want anything done to my body. When I die, I want to go straight into the casket as I am, all my organs in me. Well, unless I donate. Organ donation, by the way, is acceptable in the Orthodox Church. We'll talk more about that later. It's not all organ donations. It really depends how they're going to be used. But that's also another topic for another day. But I want my body to go into the casket with no makeup, nothing. No embalming. I want my own blood in there, and I want to be buried relatively quickly in a pine box. They put pillows in these caskets and all this stuff. The person doesn't need to be comfortable. They're dead. Okay. We now have burial shrouds, which I bought from the monastery, and they're at our church. And it's kind of sad that people have told me that they don't want them. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be covered with a cross? Some people prefer to be covered with a WVU flag. How's WVU going to get you into heaven, right? I'm sure you love WVU. That's fine. But how's that going to get you into heaven? We have burial shrouds with Christ crucified on it, with angels and Christ himself on it. That's what we should be covering ourselves with for our burial, not WVU or even the American flag. America is great to live in when you're alive, but how about after that? Now we're talking about we have to leave this world, right? If we're still holding on to things of this world, I remember I refused once. Somebody wanted to put a little slot machine in the casket with somebody who had died, and I refused. And I said, no, gambling is a sin, and you are almost like tempting God or teasing God. If this person gambled when they were alive, they should have repented of it before they died. Don't put this in the casket with them. So, think about what you want in your casket with you. It should just be you. As a priest, I'll be in my full vestments. My face will be covered with the air. That's the piece of cloth that I wear on my back during the great entrance and I cover the gifts with. And then I will have the gospel book in my hand. And that's how a priest is buried. As a layperson, you want to be buried in something respectable. White is actually preferable because it's that baptismal garment that we're supposed to be buried into and go to the kingdom with. And then you want to have some kind of a cross. It doesn't have to be your gold cross. Maybe you want to give your gold cross, leave it behind to somebody, but some kind of a cross. And then the burial shroud, which has a big cross on it. That's how we should be buried. So anyway, going back to the question, I believe the casket should be open, and that's the teaching of the Orthodox Church. It's always been that the casket was open. By the way, flowers used to be brought to funerals in the old days before embalming because the corpse would smell, and so the flowers, especially in the summertime, the flowers would try and hide some of that stench. So now we don't really need flowers, and we generally only do like 1 or 2 pieces inside the church. There's no need for that. Plus, your priest has bad allergies, so it'll make it so I can't sing at the funeral service. So thank you, Beverly, for that question. We have a number of other questions here. Great questions today. So we will keep going here. So could you explain the hierarchy of Orthodox clergy, their status of responsibility, and when and why they can no longer marry? All right, so I'll kind of work backwards on that. For an Orthodox clergyman to be married, they have to be married before they are ordained to the diaconate. And actually, the canons even say before the subdiaconate, but it's become the practice in our archdiocese that you can be ordained a subdeacon and then get married later, and the bishop has the ability to do that. For a very short period of time in our archdiocese's history, they were allowing young men to be ordained deacons and then get married afterwards. That's just because they really needed some deacons. Again, the bishop can exercise what's called economia or economy, and allow certain canons to be bent for a specific case. So sometimes we see things like that. But so I had to get married before I was ordained a deacon. If I had gotten ordained a deacon without getting married, I would no longer be eligible to marry. And if I got married, I would be defrocked, meaning no longer a deacon or a priest. So I got married before I was a deacon. Then I got ordained deacon and then priest. The deacon's job is primarily to assist the priest. So if you look back to the book of the Acts of the Apostles, the job of the deacon was to do some of the social ministry that the priest didn't have time to do. The apostles said that it would be wrong for them to not teach the classes. So I get criticized sometimes as a priest. They say, well, the priest isn't visiting enough people. He's not calling enough people. That's not the job of the priest. That's the job of a deacon. The job of the priest is to teach the gospel. So my job should be serving the services, first and foremost, and preparing like my Bible studies, doing educational things like this. These are things that the priest should do. Going to serve the widows and the sick, that's a job of the deacon. The deacon liturgically helps the priest, but doesn't really do the services himself. So that is the job of a deacon, the job of a priest. The bishop is the overseer. Literally in Greek, his title is episkopos. And in English, a lot of times it just gets translated overseer as opposed to bishop. And because bishop is a Germanic word. But overseer, episkopos, it's like epi means over, and skopos is like a scope, to see. So an overseer. So the bishop is the administrator, excuse me. The bishop is the administrator over the diocese, and he's the head priest. And what you call the priest, like myself, we're all known in the Bible. You read about us as presbyters. There's a council of presbyters that work with the high priest, who is, that real high priest is Jesus Christ, but his vicar, I guess, or his icon on earth is the bishop. And then I am the icon of the bishop, which also makes me an icon of Christ. But you have the bishop as the head of the diocese and the presbyters around him. So it's kind of like a round table, but the bishop is the head of the round table. And we discuss issues, pastoral issues, theological issues. Not that we change any theology. We just help each other to understand them, make sure that all of our brother priests are teaching the correct things, or else the bishop has to correct him. So those are kind of the different main levels. So there are three main levels of clergy: the deacon, the presbyter or priest, and the bishop, the overseer. Within those ranks, there are more ranks. So the deacon, the subdeacon doesn't really count. The subdeacon is not even really clergy. He's what's called minor order of clergy. It's not a major order. Okay, so you have the deacon. You have what's called a proto deacon and an archdeacon. He's still just a deacon. He can't do anything special. Proto deacon means he's the first among deacons. So if there's a deacon who's like very experienced, he may serve as a like the head deacon. Or you have an archdeacon who serves usually with the archbishop. So he travels with the bishop. And the archdeacon is the highest deacon. And he would trump all the other deacons in a service. Why do they do that? Because if he serves with the bishop and the bishop is coming to serve, let's say he's only been a deacon 2 years, but the deacon at the church has been there for 40 years. Well, the bishop's deacon knows how to serve the hierarchical liturgy better because that's why he's with the bishop. And so he will serve as the first deacon because he's the bishop's deacon. Okay? The priest, there are a lot of honorary titles for priests. We don't get too much into that in our archdiocese. But mostly what you have is the presbyter when he's ordained. When he is given the right to hear confessions, he receives that diamond piece of vestment that he wears on his vestments. It's called the epigonation. Epigonation, it literally means on the knee. And it means that he is what's called a pneumatikos, which means a confessor. He's allowed to hear confessions. The next level would be a proto-presbyter. In Greek, again, proto-presbyter means the first among presbyters. We incorrectly refer to proto-presbyters as archpriests. The bishop is the archpriest. In Greek, archierev, which literally means archpriest, is referring to the bishop. So, like you see Father George Corey and Father Olaf Scott in our church wearing their crosses, they're actually, the correct term is proto-presbyters, and we've been using that term incorrectly in our archdiocese for years. And if you think, well, who am I to be an expert on the topic? You can just ask Bishop Basil, who is literally the expert. He's written the book on liturgics in our archdiocese, and he will tell you that we incorrectly use that term. So it's not just my opinion. We were actually using this term incorrectly for many years. And a lot of our priests just go with it. Sometimes I even refer to them as archpriests, just because people already know what I'm talking about. If I say proto-presbyter, they're going to need me to explain the whole thing. So that's what a proto-presbyter is. Then you have the highest level of the priesthood is called an archimandrite. That's only for a celibate priest. And technically, that is supposed to be a priest who is the abbot of a monastery. It's not just, nowadays we do it if a priest is celibate, instead of making him a proto-presbyter, we just go straight to making him an archimandrite. That's an incorrect use of an archimandrite. The archimandrite is the abbot of a monastery. He's somebody one step away from a bishop, who a lot of archimandrites never become bishops because they're abbots of the monastery. They have no desire to become bishops. They're monastics, and that's all they want to be. So they have no desire to go up. Other levels, you have a hieromonk, which means a monk who's also a priest. And they also wear the black veil on their head like an archimandrite or a bishop, because the bishop's veil that he wears on his black hat is actually a monastic thing. It's not a bishop thing. It's a sign that he's a monk. Ironically, most of our bishops are not monks, which is like, oh, why are they wearing it? Traditionally, all bishops had to be monks, and they were chosen from the monasteries. Somehow that tradition got lost, unfortunately. You also have a title of priest called igumenos, which is also the head of a monastery that's not an archimandrite. So you could have an igumenos who's not quite there to be an archimandrite yet. An igumen or igumenos. The Russian church has a lot more levels of priests, including something called a mitred archpriest. So the mitre that the bishop wears, they have archpriests who can be married who wear those, except they don't have the cross on the top. That's how you can tell the difference. We don't have that in the Byzantine tradition at all. So you'll never see that in one of our churches unless it's a priest who's visiting. And again, the Russians have a lot of other titles. The Byzantine tradition, we have some other things, but they're more like functional. So we have maybe a priest called the Proto Singelos, who literally, that means first cellmate. So the Proto Singelos in our archdiocese, there's only one. His name is Father Timothy Ferguson. He's a priest in St. George in West Roxbury in the Boston area. And again, it's become an honorary title. Really, first cellmate means he is the priest, or doesn't even have to be a priest, could be a monastic, who lives with the bishop in order to keep the bishop safe from temptations. And if anyone ever accuses the bishop of something inappropriate, the proto-singulos can say, no, I was there. That's not true. But again, it's more honorary now. The Metropolitan doesn't have a proto-singulos living with him at the archdiocese. Okay, so that is, and the proto-singulos would oftentimes be the confessor for the bishop. So that's a lot of, there are some other things, but we don't need to get into all that now. Bishops, there are different levels of bishops. There's the patriarch, who's the head of an autocephalous patriarchate. Then you can have an autocephalous church, like, for example, the Church of Cyprus is not a patriarchate, but it's autocephalous, which means αυτοκεφάλαια, which means the self-headed, right? So the head of an autocephalous church is an archbishop. So like Cyprus has an archbishop who is the head of that church. So they are right up there with the patriarchs, and they're like equal with the patriarchs. Under the patriarchs, and there are different structures in the different patriarchates. In Antioch and in Russia, you have the patriarch, and then you have metropolitans underneath him. Then you have within the metropolises possibly dioceses. So like Metropolitan Joseph is a metropolitan in our archdiocese. He's under Patriarch John, and then he has bishops under him. Now, it's a little confusing what we have. They should be diocesan bishops, and they were for a little short period of time, but then the archdiocese changed the structure, and they went back to being auxiliary bishops. So as auxiliary bishops, they are not necessarily bishops of the diocese. They are, but they're not. They can be reassigned to a different diocese. We saw that recently over the past couple of years with Bishop Nicholas. He was the Bishop of Brooklyn. He got transferred down after Bishop Antoon retired, and he became the Bishop of Miami, Florida. Generally, bishops don't move around, though. Once you're a bishop of an area, you stay there. As an auxiliary bishop, they can move you around if they need be. Then you have diocesan bishops who have a diocese. So like Bishop Thomas was actually under Metropolitan Philip enthroned as the bishop of the Diocese of Pittsburgh at the time. It later changed into the Diocese of Oakland. And then when Charleston became a cathedral, he became the bishop of Oakland, Charleston, and the Mid-Atlantic. So he has an actual land area that he's responsible for. And then you have the metropolitan or archbishop above him, and he has that administrative area. So for us, it's all of North America, Canada, and the United States. And then you have the patriarch who's in charge of the entire patriarchate of Antioch. What's interesting, though, in the Orthodox Church, this is way different than the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church, they have the Pope, right? Well, the Pope can go into any diocese, into any church, and whatever he says goes. Whatever he says goes. If Patriarch John came to my church, to our cathedral, and said, I don't want you doing this, I want you doing that, our metropolitan could say, no, we're not doing that. This is my diocese. And he's within his right to do that. Of course, he would do it very, very respectfully, and our patriarch would know not to do that anyway. Administratively, the bishop of a diocese cannot be told by any other bishop what to do in his own diocese. He can only do, he's only in charge of that diocese, and no one else can come in and interfere. Now, what happens if he's doing something wrong? Then the group above him, which is not just the metropolitan, it's the metropolitan with all the diocesan bishops. They have like a local synod, and they would correct that one bishop. And it might not even necessarily be that he's doing something wrong according to the faith. But let's say, like with COVID, all of our bishops got together and they decided how they would react as one archdiocese. That way there would be consistency, so that if you have family, for example, who lives in Toledo, you wouldn't call me and say, hey, well, the priest in Toledo is doing this with his COVID. Why aren't we doing that? So the bishops all kind of decide in their synod. Once the synod decides something, then the bishop in his diocese can't go against that because the synod has decided. So then with our metropolitan, who does he answer to? He answers to the Holy Synod, not to the Patriarch, but to the Holy Synod of Antioch. And they get together a couple of times a year and meet. And sometimes they have the authority and they do retire or even suspend a bishop. So sometimes if a bishop becomes like senile or develops dementia, they can retire him because he no longer has the capacity to serve in his see. Or the former Patriarch of Jerusalem was corrupt, or at least there were allegations of him being corrupt. All the Orthodox patriarchs got together and removed him from his see in Jerusalem. So it's possible to remove bishops. So that's a bit about the clergy. Going to move on. If a priest becomes widowed, can he remarry? That can only happen with the bishop's economia, his dispensation. It's rare to happen. They generally will only give that kind of dispensation if he has young children who he can't care for by himself. and doesn't really have a support system, they might allow him to get remarried. But it's very rare for that to happen. Distinguish between the vestments of each clergy. So we each have what we call, like, if you want to say in English, like a stole, right? So the priest has his stole, and it's called the epitrachilion, which literally means on the throat, on the trachea, right? Epitrachilion. And that's the sign of my priesthood, is that stole. If you look at it, it's actually two pieces that come together, and there are buttons in between the two sections that hold it together. So if you took that apart, it would just be like one long vestment. And if you look at it, that's what the deacon's vestment looks like. It's just one long sash. So what the deacon wears is called an orarion. So you have the orarion, and that's what the deacon holds with his hand, and he prays with it, and it gets wrapped around the shoulder. The priest has his epitrachilion, his stole, and the bishop also wears an epitrachilion, but on top of that, he wears what's called an omophorion. The omophorion is a representative of the lost sheep. So it's a sheep that he puts on his shoulders, and it shows that he represents Christ, the high priest, or the archpriest. And so that's what he wears. Now, there are different vestments also. The most basic vestment that all of us wear, the deacon, the priest, the bishop, and actually you've worn it too. It's called the sticharion. It means the garment of light. And that's our baptismal garment. So the white robe I wear under all my vestments when I serve liturgy, that's called the sticharion, and it represents my baptismal garment, although obviously it's not the garment I was actually baptized in. So the deacon wears it, and the deacon's is usually colored to match his color vestments. The priest has his, the bishop has his. You can't see the bishop's very well because he has another piece of vestment covering it. We have, for the deacon, priest, and bishop, we also have cuffs. They're called epimanica, which means on the wrists, literally, okay? Or on the manacles, right? These are your manacles. So on the hands or on the wrists. And those are very practical. Like you see my casket here, it ties it down so that it doesn't get into the Holy Communion, doesn't get in the way of the sacraments, but also it allows us to touch holy things like the body and blood of Christ, and to remind us that these are not our hands, that they are Christ's hands. When I put on the right cuff, I say, "Thy right hand, O Lord, has shattered enemies, and in the multitude of thy glory thou hast crushed thine adversaries." So it's a sign of strength. Okay? Then you have the left hand. I say, "Thy hands have made and fashioned me, O Lord, grant me understanding, and I will learn thy commandments." Okay? So those are some of those vestments. Then the priest and the bishop wear a belt across our waist, which is called the zoni. It's just a belt, right? And it's a sign, first of all, practically, it keeps our other vestments, our sticharion and epitrachilion, tied down so it doesn't get in the way of things. Very practical. But also the prayer that goes with that. And all these prayers, by the way, come from the Psalms. It says, "Blessed is God who girdeth me with power and hath made my path blameless." So it reminds us to be girded. And that's like kind of an idea of controlling the passions, of not suffering from gluttony or lust or anything like that. Then the priest wears what looks like a cape. It's called the philonion. And that's, when we put that on, it's like the glory of the priesthood. It said, "Thy priest shall be clothed with righteousness, and thy venerable ones shall rejoice with joy." In ancient icons, you'll see that the bishop also used to wear that. And then he would put the omophorion on top of that. And you may have seen Bishop Thomas sometimes serves as a priest. He'll wear priest vestments. And we're just supposed to put an omophorion over that, and then presto, you got a bishop. The bishop, though, when the Byzantine Empire fell, he took the place of both the bishop and the emperor. And so the big vestment he wears that has bells on it on the outside of his over everything else is called the sakos, and it's what the emperor used to wear. And that's also why the bishop now wears a crown, because that was the emperor's crown. So he became the head of church and state it wasn't the Byzantine Empire anymore, but he just kind of had the emperor and the bishop all rolled up into one person. The bishop also has a staff, which is a staff to shepherd the faithful. It says to guide them, but also it's a staff to shepherd and to discipline the disobedient. Also, on the top of that staff, you have the bronze serpents, right? That's an image from the Old Testament, from Moses, because when the serpents were biting the Israelites, they would die unless Moses had the bronze serpents that he lifted up, and when they looked upon that, they would be healed. And that's a sign of the cross. It's a type of the cross that when we look upon that, we'll be healed. The bishop also has his candles, the trikerion and dikerion, representing trikerion, meaning three, candles, the, meaning like die, meaning two, reminding us of the most basic truths of being a Christian, that we worship God in Trinity and the two natures of Christ. And that's why the bishop will bless us with those candles. Just a reminder, in case you didn't get the notice, July 20th and 27th, they're both Mondays. We'll be having hierarchical liturgy with Bishop Thomas for those times. The bishop also wears the mitre. Again, I said that was like his, what's it called? His emperor's hat, his crown as an emperor. Okay, the last question here on this topic, we talked a lot about the clergy today, is how to address the clergy. So deacon, you would call deacon. Some people refer to them as Father Deacon. I prefer just deacon. The priest is called Father. And so actually the Bible says, do not call anyone Father, but our Father who is in heaven, right? So why do we call the priest Father? St. Paul actually explains that, and I don't have a lot of time. There's actually, if you're interested in this, a pamphlet in the back of our church that says, call no man Father. And it explains where that comes from and why we allow people to call the priest Father. But St. Paul addresses that more. And he says you do not have many fathers, meaning that you do have some fathers, right? But I don't have the time to get into that. For a bishop, if he's a diocesan bishop or an auxiliary bishop, like Bishop Thomas, you refer to him as your grace. If he's a metropolitan or archbishop, you refer to him as your eminence. If he is the head of an autocephalous church, like the patriarch, you call him your beatitude or your holiness. The ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, they refer to him as your all holiness. And in the Antiochian tradition in Arabic, we refer to all bishops also as Sayyidna, which just means master. And in Greek, they do similar. They call Despotin. So that's that. I do have a question on here from Juliana. I promised I would answer. Juliana wants to know, why do people kiss your hand when they hand you things with the virus? She actually asked me this on Sunday after church, and I said that's a good question for Ask Abouna. So I'm going to answer it for her. So the altar boys, you may notice, hand me things throughout the service, and they kiss my hand when they give me something or take something out of my hand. Why do they continue to do that in the virus? They don't have to. I don't make it mandatory. But when you kiss the priest's hand, you're receiving a blessing. And they want that blessing. And there are a number of parishioners still kissing my hand. I, as a priest, am not allowed to refuse anybody a blessing. If you want a blessing, I don't care what disease you have, I'm going to give you a blessing. Okay? So that's why they do that, because they have faith. And they don't think they're going to get sick from kissing my hand. But even if they do get sick, they'd rather have the blessing. And that takes a lot of faith. It's not an easy thing for somebody to do. Some people would think they're crazy. I happen to think it's beautiful that they don't care about the virus. They just want a blessing from their priest. So thank you for that question, Juliana. We have a lot more questions, but we are out of time. Let me see if there's anything real quick here that I can answer. So somebody just had a follow-up to the question about which version of the Bible to read. If you're reading the Revised Standard Version or the New King James, which is the Orthodox Study Bible, or whatever it is, you're not sinning by reading the wrong one. You may not get full explanations. If you ever have questions, just ask me. I probably have to look it up and study it myself. If you can't afford another version of the Bible, don't worry about it. And there are lots of versions of the Bible online you could read for free. So I know for a fact you can get the New King James and the Revised Standard Version for free online. So you can read whatever you have. There are some versions that are probably horrible, that you shouldn't read at all. If you're able to read an adult version of the Bible, it's better not to read a children's version, but children's versions are good for children. So I wouldn't say, again, that you're doing something bad by reading a different version. Again, anything that's a translation is a falling short of the original, but we can't all learn Greek and Hebrew. Here's another question. Does God want us to lead a less theologically advanced lifestyle? I'm not sure I really understand that. God wants us to be does God want us to lead a less technologically advanced lifestyle? See, I'm thinking theology all the time. Yeah, he probably does. Technology is not evil until it takes us away from God. And I know with a lot of people, including myself, I'm like a little too addicted to my phone. And if I'm on my phone or watching TV or on my computer, I'm not praying. I'm not feeding people. I'm not helping people. So God does want me to be on my technology probably a lot less, so I can be doing better things. And I've been trying to put down my phone and my TV at night to read Lives of the Saints. They're a lot better than anything I could watch on TV. So that's a good question. Thank you. I have a couple other questions here. See if I can answer them real quick. What's the difference between a rosary bead and a prayer rope? I notice some people use it as an accessory and not actually pray with, but my father only takes out his rosary beads when he attends a funeral, as he is Catholic. So I would say the Orthodox prayer rope actually has a beautiful story, and I don't have the time to get into it right now. You can ask again next week if you'd like. But the prayer rope, it was not taught to us by the angels, and he said that this is a knot that cannot be untied, meaning your prayer cannot be untied by the devil, because to make an actual knot of the prayer rope, I've made them before, there are 9 crosses that go into that prayer rope, and there's like a story behind it. So it's really cool. So the prayer rope is, for me, better to pray with because there's a meaning, and when they were made in prayer. So there is a difference, but if you're using it to pray, I'm just glad you're praying. The next question is, how do you feel when you hear someone talk down about the Christian Orthodox faith, as if they're calling our faith wrong? Do you get angry, and how do you handle that? I don't get angry. I mean, look what people did to Christ. They were extremely rude to him. They even spit in his face, imprisoned him, crucified him. They literally killed him. And he said, if they did it to me, imagine what they're going to do to you. He said, if they did it to you, know that they've already done it to me. And he's God, right? So I don't get mad when people do that. It's usually out of ignorance. They don't know any better. If they're doing it to be mean or rude, I'll probably end the conversation, not enter into conversation. I don't have to defend God. God could smite them like that, just like Jesus said, don't you think I could call down legions of angels to rescue me? God is bigger than that. God doesn't need our protection. I get sad for them sometimes. I may pray for them that God enlighten them, but I generally don't get mad. A lot of times I find that it's through ignorance, and I might respond to something they say out of love and to try and teach them. If I see they're willing to accept it, I'll continue. If I see that they're not willing to accept it, the book of Proverbs teaches us not to try and teach somebody who's ignorant like that, because you're just hurting them and hurting yourself. So if somebody is accepting of criticism or of correction, go ahead and do it. If they're not, don't do it. So thank you. That's all the time we have. Thank you all for joining us. We had tons of great questions. God bless you and have a good night.